Sometimes the strongest men fall the hardest, and sometimes it takes the love of one brave woman to bring them back. In Brightwater, they said Jude Carver couldn't be killed. He survived things that would have buried any other man. But when the doctor said his time had come, the whole town prepared for his funeral. Then Elara Wynn did something nobody expected. She refused to let him die alone. What happened between them changed everything. Because when a dying man meets a woman who believes in miracles, something powerful takes root. Could love truly give a man reason to fight death itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Brightwater sat nestled in a valley where the Montana Territory met the sky, a place where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels and the wind carried the scent of pine and possibility. It was 1878, and the frontier still held its grip on the land and the people who dared to call it home. The main street was nothing more than packed dirt that turned to mud when the rains came, lined with wooden buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired from standing against the elements. There was the general store, the blacksmith's forge, the trading post, and Doc Brennan's office with its hand-painted sign that had faded to something barely legible. Jude Carver was 42 years old, though the mountains had aged him in ways that numbers couldn't capture. His face was weathered leather, carved with lines that spoke of sun and wind and winters, that tested a man's will to see another spring. He stood just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who'd spent their lives working with their hands. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and he kept it long enough to tie back when he was skinning a deer or setting traps along the creek beds that fed into the Pates Valley. He'd come to Montana after the war, after Shiloh and Gettysburg had taken something from him that he couldn't name but felt missing all the same. He'd been a young man then, 23 and hollow-eyed, looking for a place where the quiet was louder than the memories. He found it 3 miles outside Brightwater, in a cabin that had belonged to a trapper who died alone one winter. Jude buried what was left of him and claimed the place as his own, and for 20 years he'd lived a life that most men couldn't endure for 20 days. He was a mountain man in the truest sense. He trapped beaver and marten, hunted elk and bear, guided hunting parties when he needed the money, and disappeared into the high country for months at a time. The people of Brightwater knew his name and his reputation. They knew he'd survived a Blackfoot ambush that killed 2 other men. They knew he'd spent an entire winter snowed in with nothing but dried meat and his own thoughts, and come down in spring looking no worse for it. They knew about the grizzly that had come at him near Copper Creek, and how he'd killed it with his hunting knife when his rifle misfired. That knife was always on his hip, the handle carved from elk antler and worn smooth from 2 decades of use. It had been his constant companion. The one thing he trusted absolutely in a world that had taught him trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Once a month, Jude rode into Brightwater for supplies. He'd tie his horse outside the general store, nod to whoever was standing on the boardwalk, and go about his business with few words. He had a limp, slight but noticeable, from a mini-ball that had shattered his hip at Cold Harbor. The army surgeon had done what he could, but the bone hadn't set right, and Jude had learned to live with the hitch in his step and the ache that came with weather changes. The general store was run by Martha Hayes, a widow woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who knew everyone's business and most of their secrets. She'd been one of the first settlers in Brightwater, had buried a husband and 2 sons to frontier hardships, and had survived through sheer stubbornness and good sense. Working for Martha was Elara Wynn, who'd come to Brightwater 3 years ago from somewhere back east that she didn't talk much about. She was 28, unmarried, which raised eyebrows in a place where women were scarce and marriages were practical arrangements, as often as they were matters of the heart. But Elara had made it clear from the start that she wasn't interested in the usual proposals. She could read and write and cipher, kept the store's books with a neat hand, and had a way of listening to people that made them feel heard without her having to say much in return. She was handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair she kept pinned up and eyes that were somewhere between green and grey, changing with the light. She had capable hands, the kind that could stitch a wound or knead bread or handle a rifle if needed. There was a quietness to her, a self-possession that some men found unsettling and others found fascinating. For 2 years, Elara had watched Jude Carver come and go. She'd noticed things about him that others missed, the way his jaw tightened when someone asked about his plans, the way his eyes would drift to the mountains visible through the store's front window, as if he was already gone, even while standing at the counter. She'd noticed how he always bought good coffee and cheap whiskey, how he never haggled over prices, how he treated Martha with quiet respect. She'd noticed, too, the way he moved, favouring his left side, and how sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd press his hand against his ribs and breathe through something that looked like pain. There had been moments between them, brief and easy to dismiss. The time their hands had brushed when she'd handed him his change and he'd pulled back, as if burned. The afternoon when she'd been carrying a heavy crate and he'd taken it from her without asking, set it down where she needed it, and left without waiting for thanks. The morning when she'd looked up from the counter to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, before he'd turned away and asked Martha for tobacco. The town had its rhythms and its people. Tom Cordell ran the blacksmith's forge, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and a gentle way with horses. Doc Samuel Brennan had trained back east before coming west for reasons he kept to himself, and he did what he could with the limited supplies and knowledge available on the frontier. There were farmers and ranchers, drifters and settlers, families trying to carve out lives in a land that gave nothing easily. And then there was Jude, who belonged to the mountains more than the town, who came down from his cabin like a ghost passing through, solid enough to touch but never quite there. It was October when everything changed. The aspens had turned gold and the air carried the promise of snow. Jude rode into town on a Tuesday morning, his horse loaded with pelts for trading. He conducted his business at the trading post, bought his supplies at the general store, and was preparing to leave when something went wrong. Elara was inside arranging canned goods when she heard the commotion. She came to the door and saw Jude collapsed in the street, his horse standing over him with its ears pinned back in distress. Men were already gathering, and Martha was calling for the doctor. The quiet that followed was the kind that comes before a storm, heavy and expectant. Doc Brennan knelt in the dirt, his hands moving over Jude with practiced efficiency. When he looked up, his face told the story before his words did. The mountain man who couldn't be killed was dying, and everyone knew it. Doc Brennan's office smelled of carbolic acid and old leather. They'd carried Jude there on a makeshift stretcher, 4 men struggling under his weight despite the wasting that had already begun. Elara stood in the doorway while the doctor worked, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The examination took 20 minutes. The doctor's face grew grimmer with each passing moment. When he finally straightened and wiped his hands on a cloth, the silence in the room was absolute. "It's the old wound," Doc Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who delivered too much bad news in his life. "From the war, I'd wager." Something's torn inside, been bleeding slow for who knows how long. Now it's bleeding faster. There's nothing I can do. Not here, not with what I have. Maybe back east, with a real hospital and surgeons who specialize in this sort of thing. But even then, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. How long? Tom Cordell asked from where he stood by the window. Weeks. Maybe a month if he's lucky. The pain will get worse. He'll weaken gradually, then all at once. I'm sorry. Jude lay on the examination table, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. His face was grey beneath the tan, and there was a tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain held carefully in check. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. I want to go home. Jude, you need, the doctor began. I said I want to go home. This time, there was steel beneath the words. I've got things to settle. I won't die in this room. There was a quality to his certainty that made argument pointless. Doc Brennan sighed and nodded. I'll give you something for the pain. Use it sparingly. When it gets bad, send someone for me. Won't be necessary. The doctor's jaw worked, but he said nothing more. He prepared a bottle of laudanum and handed it to Martha, who'd appeared in the doorway beside Elara. The two women exchanged a look that needed no words. By afternoon, word had spread through Brightwater like wildfire. The mountain man was dying. Jude Carver, who'd survived everything the frontier could throw at him, was finally going to fall. There was a sort of collective disbelief mixed with the inevitable acceptance that came with frontier life. Death was never far away out here. It took the young and the old, the careful and the reckless. It was only surprising that it had taken this long to catch up with Jude. Men offered to ride with him back to his cabin. Jude refused them all. He sat his horse in the street, swaying slightly, and fixed each man with a look that brooked no argument. He'd come to town alone. He'd leave alone. That was how he'd lived, and apparently, that was how he'd die. Elara watched from the store window as he rode out. The sun was lowering in the west, painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Jude sat straight in the saddle, despite the pain she knew he must be feeling, and he didn't look back. That evening, as Martha was closing up the store, Elara made her decision. She moved through the aisles with purpose, gathering supplies. Clean bandages, herbs for poultices, tins of food that would keep, coffee and sugar, blankets, the good soap that Martha kept for special customers. "What are you doing, girl?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "He shouldn't die alone," Elara said simply. "Elara," Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "You know what people will say. Let them say it. You're an unmarried woman. He's an unmarried man. You go up to that cabin. Stay with him. I don't care about my reputation, Martha. I care that a good man is going to die alone in the mountains because he's too stubborn to ask for help." Martha studied her for a long moment. Then she sighed and began helping gather supplies. "You'll need warmer clothes. And take the rifle from behind the counter. The good one, not the old musket. And for heaven's sake, take enough food for both of you. You're not going to try to stop me." "Would it work?" Elara smiled despite everything. "No. Then I won't waste my breath. But Elara," Martha gripped her arm, "be careful. Not just with him. With yourself. I've seen how you look at him." Elara didn't deny it. There was no point. Whatever she felt for Jude Carver, it had been growing quietly for 2 years, like a seed planted in darkness waiting for light. Now there was only dying light left, but she couldn't let him face it alone. She left before dawn, riding the steady mare that Martha kept for supply runs. The trail to Jude's cabin was one she'd never traveled, but she'd heard it described often enough. 3 miles north, following the creek until it forked, then west into the foothills. The cabin sat in a clearing with the mountains rising behind it, a place where a man could see anyone coming long before they arrived. The sun was fully up when she reached the clearing. The cabin was smaller than she'd imagined, built solid from pine logs chinked with mud. There was a lean-to for the horse, a smokehouse, a woodpile that looked like it could last 2 winters. Everything was neat and orderly, the home of a man who understood that survival depended on preparation. Jude was sitting on the porch, a rifle across his knees. He watched her approach without moving, his face unreadable. Elara dismounted and tied her horse. She lifted the bags of supplies and walked toward him with her chin up and her heart hammering in her chest. "You shouldn't be here," Jude said. "Probably not. People will talk. I know. I don't need a nursemaid." Up close, she could see how much the ride home had cost him. There was a grayness beneath his skin, a tightness around his eyes. His hand on the rifle was white-knuckled. "Why?" he asked finally. It was a simple question, but the answer was complicated. Because she'd watched him for 2 years and seen something in him that called to something in her. Because she knew what loneliness looked like, wore it herself like a second skin. Because no one deserved to die alone, and especially not a man who'd spent his life alone already. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said, knowing it was only part of the truth. Jude looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and stood, wincing as he did. "Kitchen's through there, bedroom's in the back. You can have it. I'll sleep out here. You'll sleep in your own bed. I'll manage." He looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. Stubborn woman, stubborn man. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. That first evening was awkward in the way of 2 people learning to occupy the same space. Elara explored the cabin while Jude sat by the fire. It was spare but not uncomfortable. 1 room for living, 1 for sleeping. A loft overhead filled with furs and traps and supplies. The walls were bare, except for a rifle mounted above the door and a Civil War. Uniform folded in a trunk, she found a letter tucked into the pages of a Bible on the shelf beside his bed. The paper was old, the ink faded, but she could make out enough to understand. It was from his brother, dated 5 years ago. The words were stiff and formal, asking for reconciliation after some unnamed falling out. The letter had never been answered. There were bloodstains on the edge of the paper, old and brown. Whether they'd been there when the letter arrived or had come later, she couldn't tell. She made dinner from the supplies she'd brought, simple fare but hot and filling. Jude ate little but didn't refuse what she offered. When night fell, she laid out her bedroll by the fire and listened to the sound of his breathing from the bedroom. It was labored, painful, the breath of a man fighting something he couldn't win against. In the darkness, Elara wondered what she'd gotten herself into, and why, despite everything, it felt exactly like where she was meant to be. 5 weeks after Elara first arrived at the cabin, Jude's condition had stabilized into something neither of them quite trusted. He wasn't getting better, not really, but he wasn't getting worse either. The pain came and went like weather, some days manageable and others requiring the laudanum that Doc Brennan had left. But there were more good days than bad, and that was more than either of them had expected. In the evenings, after supper, Jude had taken to carving. He worked by firelight, his knife moving over a piece of pine with practiced precision, and he never said what he was making. Elara pretended not to notice. though she watched from the corner of her eye as a shape slowly emerged from the wood. A bird, wings spread as if caught mid-flight, every feather rendered with careful detail. It was beautiful, and it broke her heart because she knew what it meant. He was making something that would last beyond him, a gift, a goodbye. Their days had fallen into patterns that felt almost like a life. She'd wake wrapped in his arms, the two of them fitting together in the narrow bed like pieces that had always belonged that way. They'd lie there in the early light, neither speaking, just breathing together and listening to the sounds of morning, the chickens scratching in the yard, the wind through the pines, the distant call of a hawk. Over breakfast, Jude would tell her things about the mountains, which passes would be snowed in by December, where to find shelter if caught in a sudden storm, how to cache food away from bears. He taught her like he was preparing her for something, and they both knew what that something was. But there were other moments too, lighter ones. The morning she burned the biscuits so badly that even the chickens wouldn't eat them, and Jude had laughed until he had to sit down. The afternoon they'd walked to the creek, and he'd taught her to fish, standing behind her with his arms around hers, guiding the line. The evening, she'd asked him to dance, and he'd said he didn't know how, and she'd said neither did she, so they'd made it up as they went, shuffling around the cabin floor while humming a tune neither could carry. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the year he'd spent learning to trap from an old French voyageur who drank too much and knew everything worth knowing about beaver. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about streets crowded with people and air thick with coal smoke, about how she'd always felt like she was suffocating until she came west. "Why Brightwater?" he asked one night, both of them lying in bed, her head on his chest. "It was as far as my money would take me. And Martha needed help in the store. Seemed like fate." "You believe in fate?" "I didn't used to." She traced the scar on his shoulder, the one from the Confederate mini-ball. "Now, I'm not sure. What are the chances that I'd end up in this particular town, and you'd happen to come down from your mountain once a month, and I'd be standing at that window the first time you rode in? Slim to none." "Exactly. So maybe there's something to it. Maybe we were always supposed to find each other, even if the timing is—" She stopped, unable to finish. Jude's arms tightened around her. "Terrible," he finished softly. "The timing is terrible." They lay in silence, listening to the fire pop and settle. Then Jude said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About after. About you after I'm gone. You should go back to town. Martha will take you back at the store. You'll be able to rebuild your reputation. Eventually." Elara pushed up on her elbow to look at him. "I don't want to talk about after. We have to. I need to know you'll be all right." "I won't be all right." "How could I be?" Her voice cracked. "You think I can just go back to town and stock shelves and make small talk with customers like none of this happened? Like I didn't—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Like I didn't fall in love with you?" It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. The words hung between them, enormous and terrifying and true. Jude reached up and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I love you too. That's why I need to know you'll survive this." "I'll survive. I always do. But don't ask me to pretend it won't destroy me, because it will." He pulled her down into a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, and they made love with a fierce tenderness that left them both shaking. Afterward, Elara lay awake long into the night, listening to Jude's breathing and trying to memorize everything about this moment. The weight of his arm across her waist, the smell of wood smoke and pine, the way his breath stirred her hair. She was building a treasury of memories to live on when there was nothing else left. The next morning she woke to find him gone from the bed. She pulled on her robe and found him on the porch, staring out at the mountains. The sun was just rising, painting the peaks in shades of pink and gold. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, joining him. "Didn't want to." He glanced at her. "Sleeping feels like wasting time." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You need to rest. I'll have plenty of time to rest soon enough." The bitterness in his voice was new, and it scared her. "Jude, I'm sorry. He stopped, his jaw working. "I keep thinking about all the years I wasted, 20 years alone in these mountains, and for what? What was I proving? What was I so afraid of? You were protecting yourself. After the war, after everything you'd been through, I was being a coward." He looked at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I could have had this, a home, a woman who loved me, a real life, but I was too scared to try. And now, there's no time left." Elara moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "We have now. That's more than nothing." And maybe she hesitated, then decided to say it. "Maybe you're not done yet. You've lasted longer than Doc Brennan said you would. Maybe you'll last longer still. Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't give me hope like that. It's cruel." "Is it hope that's cruel or despair?" He stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. Then he kissed her, hard and hungry, and she kissed him back with everything she had. That afternoon, Tom Cordell rode up to the cabin with news. Jude's brother had written to the doctor, asking about Jude's condition. He'd heard about the diagnosis somehow, and he wanted to come see him, to make peace after years of estrangement. Jude stood holding the letter, his face unreadable. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "What happened between you two?" Elara asked gently. "Stupidity, mostly. He thought I was throwing my life away coming west. I thought he was a fool for staying east and taking over the family farm. We said things. He married a woman I didn't approve of. I didn't come to the wedding. Time passed, and it got easier not to reach out than to try. And now?" Jude looked at the letter again. "Now I'm dying, and he wants to say goodbye." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe I should let him." The morning sickness started subtly, just a vague queasiness that Elara attributed to worry and lack of sleep. But when it continued for 3 days running, and she found herself unable to face the smell of coffee that she'd always loved, understanding dawned with the force of a lightning strike. She was pregnant. She sat on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and felt the world tilt sideways. Joy and grief crashed over her in equal measure. A baby, Jude's baby, a piece of him that would live on even after. She couldn't finish the thought. For a full day, she kept the knowledge to herself, turning it over like a stone in her pocket. She watched Jude move around the cabin, saw the way he tired more easily now, the way pain flickered across his face when he thought she wasn't looking. He was getting weaker. Not dramatically, but steadily. The temporary reprieve was ending. How could she tell him? Would the news bring him joy or just make everything harder? Would he feel trapped by obligation, or would it give him something to fight for? She was still wrestling with these questions when Jude noticed something was wrong. "You've been quiet today," he said that evening. They were sitting by the fire, her with mending in her lap that she'd made no progress on, him working on the wooden bird that was nearly finished now. "Just thinking." "About what?" She looked at him, this man she loved, with a fierceness that still surprised her, and almost told him, but fear stopped her tongue. About your brother, about whether you'll write back. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been thinking about that too. Jude set down his carving. I think I will. You were right. Life's too short for old grudges. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on either of them, and he smiled sadly. Even shorter than I'd like. In her mother's recipe book, pressed between pages about healing salves and fever remedies, Elara had kept a pressed wildflower from the summer. She'd found it on one of her walks before coming to the cabin, a delicate purple bloom that had seemed too beautiful to let fade. Jude had discovered it one day while looking for a poultice recipe, and he'd asked her about it. Hope, she'd said simply. For spring, for things that bloom again even after winter. Now, watching him work on his carving, she thought about cycles and seasons, about how life persisted even in the face of death, about the child growing inside her, a spring that would come even through the deepest winter. She had to tell him. But first, she needed to be sure. The next morning, while Jude was outside tending to the horses, Elara was sick behind the cabin. Martha had told her once about the signs of pregnancy, back when they'd been discussing a young woman in town who'd found herself in trouble. Morning sickness, tender breasts, exhaustion. Elara had all of them. When she came back inside, Jude was sitting at the table, and the look on his face stopped her in her tracks. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. What? No. You've been distant for days. You barely touched your breakfast. You keep looking at me like you're memorizing my face. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the hurt beneath it. It's all right. I understand. This has been too much. You should go back to town, back to your life. Jude, no. You don't owe me anything, Elara. What we had, it's been... His voice cracked. It's been more than I deserved, but I won't hold you here out of guilt or obligation. She crossed to him and took his hands in hers. I'm not leaving, and I'm not here out of guilt. Then what's wrong? Because something's wrong, and you won't tell me what it is. She looked into his eyes, saw the fear and confusion there, and made her decision. She would tell him, but not like this, not in the midst of misunderstanding. She needed the right moment, the right words. I'm scared, she said, which was true. Every day I wake up afraid that this will be the day you... She couldn't finish. I'm just scared. Understanding softened his expression. He pulled her into his lap, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight. I'm scared too, he admitted against her hair. Terrified, not of dying but of leaving you. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the morning light. That night, Jude's pain returned with a vengeance. He tried to hide it, but Elara knew the signs now. The way his breathing would go shallow, the tightness around his mouth, the way his hand would press unconsciously to his ribs. She prepared a stronger dose of laudanum than usual and sat with him while he drank it. Within an hour, the lines of pain had smoothed from his face, but the cost was a growing fog in his eyes, a distance that scared her more than the pain had. Elara, he said, his voice slurred with the drug. If something happens, nothing's going to happen. If it does, I need you to know. He reached for her hand, his grip weak. You made me happier than I've been in 20 years, than I've ever been, maybe. Whatever happens, I want you to remember that. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I love you. I love you too. Always will, even after... Don't. She pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't say it. He kissed her fingers instead, and soon after, the laudanum pulled him under into sleep. Elara sat beside him through the night, one hand on his chest to feel the rise and fall of his breathing, the other pressed to her own stomach where their child grew. She made a decision in the darkness, watching the fire burn low. She would tell him tomorrow. No matter what, he deserved to know. He deserved to know that his legacy would live on, that he wouldn't die without leaving something precious behind. But tomorrow came with its own reckoning, and all her careful plans would shatter like glass. Jude didn't wake up the next morning. Elara discovered it at dawn, when she reached out to touch his shoulder and found him cold and still. Panic seized her so completely that for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at his motionless form. Then she pressed her fingers to his throat and found a pulse. Weak and thready, but there. He was alive, but he wouldn't wake. She called his name, shook him gently, then harder. Nothing. His breathing was so shallow she had to put her cheek near his mouth to feel it. His skin had taken on a grey pallor that made him look already dead. Elara ran. She threw on her coat and boots and ran for her horse, rode into town faster than she'd ever ridden before. The sun was barely up when she hammered on Doc Brennan's door, gasping out what had happened. The doctor didn't ask questions. He grabbed his bag and followed her back to the cabin, where they found Jude exactly as she'd left him. Doc Brennan's examination was thorough and grim. He checked pulse, breathing, pressed on Jude's abdomen, lifted his eyelids to check his pupils. Finally, he sat back and looked at Elara with an expression that made her stomach drop. The bleeding's gotten worse. Internal. There's nothing I can do for him now. Hours, maybe, I'm sorry. No. The word came out flat and absolute. No, that's not acceptable. Elara. He's fought this long. He's not giving up now. Doc Brennan's face was kind but resigned. Sometimes the body just can't fight anymore. I'll stay with you if you'd like. He shouldn't be alone when... Get out. The doctor blinked. What? Get out. Elara's voice was shaking but fierce. If all you're going to do is stand there and tell me he's dying, then get out. I don't need you here. Elara, I understand you're upset, but please. She looked at him, and tears were streaming down her face now. Please just go. I need to be alone with him. Doc Brennan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and set his bag down. The laudanum is there if he wakes, and the pain is bad. Send someone for me if... He stopped. I'll check back this evening. After he left, Elara sat beside Jude's bed and took his hand. It was cool in hers, the calluses she'd learned by touch rough against her palm. She brought it to her lips and kissed his knuckles, then pressed it to her cheek. Don't you dare leave me, she whispered. Not yet. Not before I tell you. By mid-morning, word had spread through Brightwater. Martha arrived first, bringing food and blankets and her quiet, steadfast presence. Tom Cordell came next, hat in his hands, asking if there was anything he could do. By afternoon, there were people gathered outside the cabin. Not many, but enough. The townsfolk who'd come to respect Jude's fight, who'd been moved by Elara's devotion. They kept a vigil. These frontier people who understood that death was a community affair. They brought food and firewood and prayers. They told stories about Jude, about times he'd helped them or taught them or simply impressed them with his endurance. But Elara heard none of it. She sat beside Jude's bed, holding his hand, and talked to him. She told him about the first time she'd seen him ride into town, how he'd taken her breath away. She told him about the nights she'd lain awake thinking about him, imagining conversations they might have. She told him about how much these weeks had meant to her, how he'd made her feel alive in a way she'd never felt before. And then, near dawn, when they were alone and she thought he might never wake to hear it, she told him about the baby. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice breaking. "We made a child. Together. Jude. A little piece of you that will live on no matter what happens. I was so scared to tell you, scared it would make everything harder, but you need to know. You need to know that you're not dying without leaving something beautiful behind." She described the child she imagined. A boy with his father's dark hair and steady hands, or a girl with a wild spirit and love for the mountains. She painted a picture of birthdays and first steps and teaching a child to track deer through the snow. "I'll tell them about you," she promised through her tears. "Every day. I'll tell them about your strength and your kindness and how you survived everything the world threw at you. I'll tell them about how you loved me and how I loved you. They'll know their father was a good man." She laid her head on his chest and cried, her hand pressed to his heart, feeling the slow, faltering beat beneath her palm. And then, impossibly, his hand tightened on hers. Elara's head snapped up. Jude's eyes were open, focused on her face with an intensity that took her breath away. "Baby?" The word was barely a whisper, rough and wondering. "Yes." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Our baby." Something transformed in his expression. The resignation that had been there for weeks, the acceptance of death, shattered like ice in spring. His other hand came up to touch her face, trembling but sure. "I have to fight," he said, his voice stronger now. "I have to. You do. We need you. I need you." He pulled her down and kissed her, fierce and desperate and alive. When they broke apart, he was breathing hard, but there was color in his face that hadn't been there before. Doc Brennan arrived that evening, expecting to confirm a death. Instead, he found Jude sitting up in bed, weak but conscious, eating soup that Elara had made. The doctor stood in the doorway, his mouth actually falling open in shock. He stopped, started again. "That's impossible." "Apparently not," Jude said, and there was the ghost of his old humor in his voice. The examination that followed was thorough and confused. By every measure Doc Brennan could take, Jude should have been dead. The internal bleeding should have killed him hours ago. But somehow, impossibly, it had stopped, or slowed, or something the doctor couldn't explain with the medical knowledge available to him. "I don't understand," Doc Brennan said finally, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if your body just decided not to give up." Jude looked at Elara, and the expression on his face was pure wonder. "I have a reason not to." Word spread through the vigil outside like wildfire. The mountain man who'd been dying was alive. The woman carrying his child had somehow called him back from the edge. It became a story that would be told in Brightwater for generations, growing with each telling into something almost mythical. But inside the cabin, it was simply real. Jude was alive, weak and in pain, but alive. And growing inside, Elara was the reason he'd chosen to keep fighting. Over the following days, Jude's improvement continued. It was slow and not without setbacks, but it was undeniable. He ate more. He stayed conscious for longer periods. The grey pallor faded from his skin, and he began to hope. One evening, he went to the loft and brought down something he'd discovered weeks ago but had been afraid to acknowledge. It was a cradle, hand-carved from pine, dusty from disuse. His father had made it for him before he was born, and Jude had packed it away years ago, unable to look at it without feeling the weight of the legacy he'd abandoned. Now he set it in the corner of the cabin and began to restore it. He sanded away the dust and grime, repaired a cracked rocker, oiled the wood until it gleamed. And while he worked, he talked to the child he'd never expected to meet. "I'm going to teach you everything," he said softly, his hands moving over. "The wood, how to track a deer, how to read the weather in the mountains, how to survive when everything's against you." He paused. "But most important, I'm going to teach you that you don't have to be alone, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone love you." Elara watched from the doorway, one hand on her stomach, and believed in miracles. 2 weeks after Jude's miraculous recovery began, he was strong enough to walk to the creek without assistance. 2 weeks after that, he was chopping wood again, working in short bursts with frequent rests, but working nonetheless. Doc Brennan examined him weekly, and each time shook his head in bewilderment. "It defies all medical explanation," the doctor said after one such visit. "The internal injury that should have killed you appears to have healed, or sealed over, or something I don't have words for. I've read every medical text I own, and there's nothing like this documented anywhere. Maybe some things can't be found." "In books," Elara said, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly that was just beginning to show. The doctor looked between them and nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. This has taught me that faith and will can accomplish things that science can't explain." After he left, Jude stood at the window, looking out at the mountains he'd thought he'd never see again. "I need to make something," he said suddenly. "You're already restoring the cradle." "Not that. Something else." He turned to face her. "A ring for you. We should be married before the baby comes." Elara's breath caught. "Jude, I know we already had that conversation before everything changed, but I want to do this right. I want to marry you properly, make you my wife before God and the whole town. I want our child born legitimate, with my name. I don't care about that. I do." He crossed to her and took both her hands. "I've done a lot of things wrong in my life, Elara. Let me do this one thing right." She smiled through sudden tears. "Yes, of course, yes." The next morning, Jude took Tom Caudle with him into the foothills. There was an old silver vein there, mostly played out, but still yielding enough for a man who knew where to look. They spent 3 days working the claim, and Jude came home with a fist-sized nugget of raw silver ore. Martha loaned him books on metalworking from the collection that had belonged to her late husband. Jude studied them by firelight, memorizing techniques he'd never needed before. Tom offered the use of his forge and his guidance, and together they spent long hours heating and hammering and shaping the silver. Elara watched this transformation in the man she loved with a kind of awe. He was building something, not just surviving, but creating, making plans that extended past next week, next month. The haunted look that had lived in his eyes for all the time she'd known him was finally fading, replaced by something she could only call hope. The ring he crafted was simple but beautiful. A plain band of silver, smooth and unadorned, except for a tiny mountain peak he'd etched into the inside. When he showed it to her, she cried. "It's perfect," she said, turning it over in her hands. "You made this with Tom's help and a lot of cursing." He smiled. "I wanted it to be from my hands to yours, something I made, not bought. Is that all right?" "It's more than all right. It's everything. They set the date for the second week of December. It would be a small ceremony, just the people who mattered most, held at the cabin that had become their home. Martha helped Elara sew a dress from fabric the older woman had been saving for something special. It was simple calico in deep blue, fitted to accommodate Elara's growing belly, with lace at the collar that had belonged to Martha's grandmother. Jude prepared the cabin with the same intensity he'd once brought to survival. He chinked every gap in the walls against winter drafts. He stocked the woodpile until it was twice the size they'd need. He repaired the roof and reinforced the door and built shelves for the baby things that were starting to accumulate as gifts from the town. The wooden bird he'd been carving was finally finished. He presented it to Elara one evening, the pine polished to a soft glow, every detail of feathers and beak rendered with stunning precision. It was caught mid-flight, wings spread wide, and there was something joyful about it that made her throat tight. "It's for the baby's room," he said. "Something to look at and wonder about. Birds migrate, you know. They leave and they come back. Seasons change, but the birds always return." He was quiet for a moment. "I want our child to know that leaving doesn't mean not coming back, that you can go far and still find your way home." She understood what he wasn't saying, that he'd left home and humanity behind for 20 years, and she'd called him back, that he'd been lost and she'd found him. That love was the strongest compass there was. In late November, a letter arrived from Jude's brother. He would be arriving in mid-December, weather permitting. He was bringing his wife and their 2 children. He wanted to meet Elara and be present for the wedding, if that was acceptable. The letter was warm and full of regret for the years lost between them. Jude read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "He's bringing his family," he said, wonder in his voice. "I have nieces or nephews I've never met. How do you feel about that?" "Scared, excited, like I'm getting back something I didn't know how much I missed." He looked at her. "You did this. You taught me that family matters, that connection matters. I was so busy surviving alone that I forgot how to live with people. You're doing fine now." He pulled her close, careful of her growing belly. "Because of you." The preparations continued. Jude wrote secret letters to their unborn child, tucking them away in the false bottom of the cradle he'd built. Insurance, he called it, though he didn't say against what. Instructions and advice and stories. Love written down in case he wasn't there to speak it himself. He still didn't fully trust his recovery. Neither of them did. They were living in a grace period, borrowed time that could end at any moment. But they'd learned not to waste it on fear. Instead, they filled their days with life, with plans and laughter and the small, ordinary moments that make up a shared existence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elara sewing baby clothes while Jude oiled his traps for spring, she felt the baby move for the first time. A flutter like butterfly wings against the inside of her belly. "Jude." She reached for his hand and pressed it to her stomach. "Wait. There." His eyes went wide when he felt it, that tiny whisper of life pushing back against his palm. He sank to his knees beside her chair, both hands now pressed to her belly, his face transformed by wonder. "That's our child," he said, voice breaking. "That's my son or daughter in there, moving and growing and alive." He laid his head against her stomach, and she felt his tears soak through the fabric of her dress. "I never thought—" He couldn't finish. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for believing when I couldn't." She stroked his hair, dark threaded with silver, and felt the baby move again. "We weren't going to let you go without a fight." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of December morning when the air cuts like glass and the world seems new-made. Elara woke to find Jude already up, standing on the porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. She joined him, wrapped in a quilt, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified? You?" "Same." They stood in silence, watching the light spread across the valley. Then Jude said, "I want to make you a promise, right here, before anyone else arrives, just between us." "All right." He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "I promise to fight for every single day I have left. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much it hurts, I will fight to be here with you and our child, not just to survive, but to live. Really live, to be present and engaged and grateful for every moment. Jude. And I promise that if the day comes when I can't fight anymore, I won't leave without making sure you know how much you changed my life. How you took a man who was already dead inside and made him want to live again." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I promise to carry your love forward, to teach our child about courage and resilience and the strength it takes to let yourself be vulnerable, to make sure they know their father was the best man I ever knew." They held each other as the sun rose, higher, warming the frozen world, and somewhere in the cabin behind them the cradle waited, and the carved bird spread its wings, and a new life waited to be welcomed into the world. By noon the cabin was filled with people. Martha and Tom had come early to help prepare. Doc Brennan arrived with his wife, a quiet woman who rarely left their home. A handful of townspeople came, the ones who'd kept vigil and believed in miracles. And finally, in early afternoon, Jude's brother arrived with his family. The reunion was awkward at first, 20 years of silence standing between them. But then Jude's brother saw Elara, saw her pregnant belly, saw the way Jude looked at her, and something broke open in his face. "Little brother," he said, voice thick, "you're going to be a father." "I am. Then I'm going to be an uncle." They embraced, hard and fierce, and neither man bothered to hide their tears. The two children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 10, stared wide-eyed at this uncle they'd heard about but never met. Jude crouched down to their level and shook their hands solemnly, and something in that gesture, the careful respect he showed them, won them over immediately. As the afternoon light began to fade, they gathered in the cabin for the ceremony. It was simple and sincere. Doc Brennan officiating because he was the closest thing they had to official authority. Jude and Elara stood before the fire, hands joined, and spoke vows that came from the heart rather than any book. And when Jude slipped the silver ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly, everyone in that cabin knew they were witnessing something rare. Not just a wedding, but a testimony to the power of love to conquer even death itself. The vigil began again at dawn, but this time it was different. Word had spread through Brightwater, not of a death watch, but of a community gathering around one of their own. People came not to witness an ending, but to offer whatever strength they had to give. The women of the town arrived first, Martha leading them. They brought a quilt, and Elara recognized the pattern immediately. Each square had been sewn by a different woman, their names embroidered in the corners: Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca Thorne, Elizabeth Chang, Anne Cordell. Women she'd served at the store, women who'd judged her at first, and then come to admire what she'd done. "We made it for the baby," Martha said, spreading it across the foot of the bed where Jude lay. "But we wanted Jude to see it first, to know that this child will be wrapped in the love of this whole town." Jude's eyes, clouded with pain and laudanum, cleared for a moment as he looked at the quilt. His hand reached out to touch it, fingers tracing the careful stitches. "Beautiful," he managed. The men came next, Tom Cordell and the others who'd worked alongside Jude over the years. They didn't speak much, these frontier men who measured friendship in actions rather than words, but they kept the fire burning and the woodpile stocked. They tended the horses and did the 100 small tasks that kept a household running. The children came too, bringing drawings and stories. Get well wishes in crayon and pencil, pictures of mountains and horses and families. Jude looked at each one, even when it clearly cost him to focus, and thanked each child by name. "You're teaching them something," Elara said softly, watching him with the children. "About facing hard things with grace." "Learned it from you," he replied. Through the day, Elara stayed beside him. She read to him from the Bible, not because she was particularly religious, but because the rhythm of the words seemed to soothe him. She told him stories from her childhood, painting pictures with words of a world he'd never seen. She described the baby's movements, each flutter and kick, making him part of it even as he lay dying. And the town kept watch. They took turns sitting with the couple, giving Elara moments to rest, to eat, to breathe. They prayed, those who believed in such things, and those who didn't simply sat in silent solidarity, lending their presence as support. Doc Brennan came and went, checking on Jude, but offering no false hope. His vitals should have failed by now, the doctor admitted quietly to Elara. By all rights, he should already be gone. But he's holding on with a strength I've never seen before. He promised to fight, Elara said. He keeps his promises. On the third night, something shifted. Jude's fever broke, and when his eyes opened, they were clear in a way they hadn't been in days. He looked around the cabin, saw the gathered community, and something in his expression cracked open. "You're all here," he said, his voice hoarse but wondering. "Where else would we be?" Tom said gruffly. Jude's eyes filled with tears. For a man who'd spent 20 years alone, who'd thought himself forgotten and unimportant, the sight of this community gathered in his small cabin was overwhelming. "I don't deserve this," he said. "None of us deserve grace," Martha replied. "But we get it anyway. That's what community means." Elara climbed onto the bed beside him, careful of her belly, and wrapped herself around him. She felt him trembling, felt him breathing, felt the stubborn persistence of his heartbeat. "I want to live," Jude said suddenly, fiercely, into her hair. "God help me. I want to live so badly. I want to see my child born. I want to teach them everything I know. I want to grow old with you." "Then live," she whispered back. "We're all here telling you it's okay to live, to keep fighting, to stay." The baby kicked then, hard enough that Jude felt it against his own belly where they were pressed together. He let out a sound between a laugh and a sob and pressed his hand to the spot. "You feel that?" Elara said. "That's your child, telling you to fight. We're both fighting for you." Something changed in Jude's face. Some fundamental shift from resignation to determination. "I'm going to meet my child," he said, and it wasn't a hope or a wish. It was a declaration. "I'm going to hold them and know them and love them. Yes, you are. I'm going to watch them grow. Yes, I'm going to grow old, telling embarrassing stories about you." She laughed through her tears. "That's the plan." Over the next days, the impossible happened again. Jude didn't die. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The pain receded to something manageable. He began eating more, sleeping less fitfully, staying conscious for longer stretches. Doc Brennan had no explanation. "It's as if your body heard you say you wanted to live and decided to cooperate," he said, shaking his head. "I've been a doctor for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Twice." "Maybe will is stronger than we think," Elara suggested. "Or love is," the doctor replied, looking between them. "Maybe love is the strongest medicine there is." By Christmas Eve, Jude was sitting up in bed, holding Elara in his arms, his hand resting on her belly where their child grew. Outside, snow fell soft and silent, covering the world in white. Inside, the fire burned warm and bright, and a community that had gathered to say goodbye instead celebrated a miracle. "You're going to make it," Elara said, and this time she let herself believe it. "We're going to make it," Jude corrected. "All three of us." The baby kicked in agreement, and they sat together in the lamplight, wrapped in the quilt that bore the names of their community, and let themselves hope. Spring came to the Montana Territory with a rush of meltwater and the return of birds. 6 months after Doc Brennan had given Jude weeks to live, the mountain man stood in the clearing outside his cabin, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. He moved carefully, still favoring his left side, still carrying the ache of old wounds. But he was alive, and that was more than anyone had expected. Grace Carver was born on a morning in late March, when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out. Her first cry filled the cabin with a sound that Jude would carry in his heart forever. He held her minutes after she entered the world, this tiny, perfect creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same grey-green as her mother's. "She's beautiful," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She's perfect." Elara, exhausted and radiant in the aftermath of labor, smiled at him from the bed. "She has your stubborn chin. Poor child." Doc Brennan, who delivered the baby with Martha's assistance, stood back and watched the new family with an expression of profound satisfaction. "I've witnessed a lot in my years as a doctor," he said quietly. "But this, a man who should have died bringing new life into the world, this is something special." The town celebrated Grace's arrival like she belonged to all of them, which in a way she did. She was the miracle baby, born of love that had refused to accept death. Gifts poured in, blankets and clothes and carved wooden toys, a rocking horse from Tom Cordell, a silver spoon from Martha, engraved with Grace's name and birth date. Jude's brother returned in the summer with his family, and Grace met her cousins and uncle and aunt. Watching Jude with his brother's children, teaching them to track deer through the forest, while Grace napped in a sling against his chest, Elara felt a completeness she'd never thought possible. "You're a natural father," she said one evening, watching him rock Grace to sleep. "Had a good teacher." He nodded toward the cradle in the corner, where the letters he'd written still rested in the false bottom. "Though I'm glad I get to tell her these things myself instead of leaving them in writing." One afternoon in early autumn, a traveling photographer made his way through Brightwater. Jude, who'd always avoided such things, agreed. Immediately when Elara suggested a family portrait, they posed outside the cabin, the mountains rising behind them. Jude stood tall despite his limp, Grace cradled in his arms, Elara beside him with her hand on his shoulder, and something in the way the light caught them made the photographer pause. "I've taken 1,000 portraits," he said, "but I've never seen a family that looked more like they'd fought for the right to stand together." The photograph captured something essential. The strength in Jude's stance, despite the weakness his body still carried, the quiet determination in Elara's expression, the perfect innocence of Grace, unaware that her existence was itself a miracle. When the photographer delivered the finished print weeks later, Elara hung it over the mantel where everyone could see it. This was the proof. The impossible had happened. They were a family. The cabin transformed over that first year. What had been a solitary man's survival shelter became a home, filled with life. Baby clothes drying by the fire, Grace's carved bird hanging over her cradle, spinning slowly in the breeze from the open window. The quilt from the town, women draped over the rocking chair where Jude spent hours soothing his daughter to sleep. By Grace's first birthday, Elara was pregnant again. This news was received with joy rather than fear, a celebration of life continuing rather than a race against death. Jude's health remained stable, his recovery holding in ways that continued to baffle Doc Brennan, but which Elara attributed to having reasons to live that outweighed reasons to die. Purpose is powerful medicine, the doctor finally concluded, maybe the most powerful there is. On a golden afternoon in September, Jude sat on the porch steps, teaching Grace, who'd just learned to walk, how to identify different animal tracks in the soft earth. She was too young to understand, babbling happily and patting the ground with her small hands, but Jude explained, "Everything anyway. See here? That's a deer. See how the hoofprint is split? And here, this is a rabbit. Small and close together because they hop." He looked up to find Elara watching them from the doorway, one hand resting on her growing belly. Never too early to start learning. She came to sit beside them, and Grace immediately crawled into her lap. "You're a good teacher. I have a lot to teach her, a lot of time to make up for." "You're not making up for anything. You're living the life you have now. That's what matters." Jude was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch. The hands were still frozen at 3:30, the photograph of his younger self still tucked inside. He looked at it thoughtfully. "I used to carry this as a reminder that time runs out," he said, "that death was always coming. But now, I think I'll carry it as a reminder of something else." "What's that?" "That time stopped for my grandfather, but it kept going for me. That I got more time than I thought I would. That every moment is a gift, not a countdown." He closed the watch and put it back in his pocket. "When Grace is old enough, I'll give this to her, not as a burden, but as a reminder to value every moment she has." As the sun lowered toward the mountains, painting the world in amber and shadow, the three of them sat together on the porch. Grace fell asleep in Elara's arms. Jude wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. Inside the cabin, the cradle waited for the new baby who would arrive in spring. The carved bird hung above it, wings spread in eternal flight. Somewhere in town, people told the story of the mountain man who'd been saved by love, how a woman had refused to let him die alone, and how that refusal had somehow given him the strength to keep living. The story grew with each telling, but the truth at its heart remained simple. Sometimes love is strong enough to rewrite fate. Sometimes one person's faith can give another person reason to fight. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't surviving, it's learning how to truly live. Jude Carver had spent 20 years in these mountains, surviving but not living. Then Elara Wynn had ridden up to his cabin with medicine and hope and stubborn determination, and everything had changed. She'd given him a reason to fight death. He'd given her a love worth fighting for. And their daughter would grow up hearing the story of how her father was supposed to die but chose to live instead. How her mother believed in miracles, and how sometimes, when you believe hard enough and love deep enough, miracles actually happen. The mountains remained, ancient and unchanging. But the small cabin in the clearing held something the mountains could never claim. It held love and family and the sound of a child's laughter. It held a future that almost wasn't, and a present that had been fought for and won. Grace would grow up strong and capable, learning to read tracks in the snow and identify herbs for healing. She'd learn to shoot and trap and survive in the wilderness that had raised her father. But most importantly, she'd learn what Jude had learned too late and been given a second chance to embrace that no one is meant to be alone, and that love is the strongest force in the world. As darkness fell and they moved inside, Jude paused at the threshold and looked back at the mountains one last time. They'd been his refuge for 20 years, the place he'd hidden from life and loss and the fear of caring too much. Now they were simply home. And home, he'd learned, wasn't about the place. It was about the people who made you want to stay. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the wilderness night, and stepped into the warm glow of the cabin where his wife and daughter waited, where the fire burned bright and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. The mountain man who couldn't be killed had finally learned how to live, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.